Welcome to Nightingale College podcast with our series called Nursing and Nutrition. In this episode, we will discuss lipids. Now, if you remember, if you were to make maybe do a calculation to find how many calories are in fat, right? Lipids is the same as fat. If you were given maybe a food that had 10 grams of fat in it, remember that there are 9 calories per 1 gram of fat. Um, when I was in college years ago, it was really hard for me to remember that fat had 9 because if you recall, protein and carbohydrates each have 4 calories per 1 gram. So I just couldn't remember that 9 for fat. And a classmate of mine just made a joke that, you know, fat. Fat is 9 because it's sublime. And that was just a little rhyme that she made up. And that helped me remember too that there's 9 calories for 1 gram. Okay, now that doesn't mean I need you to go out and just only eat fat, right? But that's just a funny little rhyme that can help you remember that fat is sublime, and so it's 9. Because usually fat has kind of a different mouth taste to it. It can just be kind of just a rich, kind of comforting flavor, and so that's where the thought of sublime came from. So hopefully that helps you. Just a funny way that I remembered it years ago. And if that helps you as you're doing calculations, just to remember that fat is sublime and so it's 9. Great. Go ahead and use that. Um, Know too that fat has different roles in our body. We have some vitamins that are actually fat soluble vitamins. That would be vitamins A, D, E, and K. If we didn't have fat in our system and be eating enough fat, we would actually be showing symptoms of vitamin deficiency from those vitamins. Now, there are some essential fatty acids, meaning if it's essential, we have to get them from the foods that we eat. And those would be our omega 3s and our omega 6s. So, food sources of those would include salmon, flaxseed, chia seeds, walnuts, canola oil, and flaxseed oil. So, if we're not eating those things regularly throughout the week, it's very easy to become deficient in those essential fatty acids. We only get them from the foods that we eat. We can't make them in our body. Now, we have things in our body that are called lipoproteins, and that is kind of I like to think of it as like a little truck, a little vehicle that zooms around to different parts of our body, either collects fat or delivers fat, sometimes both. And that's what the lipoproteins job is. Now, we have 3 different lipoproteins we will focus on in this class. So that is VLDL, or very low density lipoprotein. LDL, which is low density lipoprotein, and HDL, which is high density lipoprotein. So, VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, has very little protein in it. That's why it's called very low, okay? Because it's that density is about how much protein is actually in that molecule. So the VLDL likes to carry lipids or triglycerides to our body cells from the liver. So I like to think of that little truck, that little VLDL um, lipoprotein truck as like a garbage truck. It's taking these extra lipids and triglycerides to our body from the liver. Um, LDL is actually a remnant of VLDL. So it becomes LDL from VLDL when it's in circulation in our body. That's why when someone has their cholesterol taken at the doctor's office or labs that you might see as you're a nurse, that LDL is the number that we look for because that's showing after that VLDL is converted how much of that LDL is in the blood. Now, LDL has that same function as VLDL, right? VLDL converts to LDL and it's still taking those lipids, like cholesterol, to body cells from the VLDL, which is started in the liver. So those are like the 2 garbage trucks. They're taking this extra fat to body cells. Okay. And I used to remember when I was in college, since LDL and VLDL each had two L's, we want them to be lower. So when someone gets their cholesterol drawn, we want that number to be lower than 100. Or sorry, not 100, lower than 200. That's kind of our goal for the LDL. We want it to be lower. Okay. Now, HDL is the number that we want it to be higher. That would be great if our HDL was high. I used to remember in college that H stood for high or heavenly. It was a good number, or healthy. So that's the healthy cholesterol that we want to have when those cholesterol labs are drawn. So we want that to be above 60. And that HDL is produced in our liver, and its role is kind of like the cleanup truck. It goes and picks up that lipid and cholesterol from body cells and takes it back to the liver. So think of like the little street sweepers you might see sometimes that are out and that are cleaning up the streets. That's what HDL's job is. It's the cleaner picker upper, and it will go ahead and carry that lipid and cholesterol away from those body cells back to the liver. That's part of why we want to have more HDL in our body, because then we just know that the streets, or our body cells are going to be cleaned up, and they're not going to be bombarded by having extra cholesterol or extra lipids. If you recall, having high LDL can be a risk of having more blockages that can occur in our bloodstream. So that would increase our risk of heart disease. It also, when there's those higher levels, is linked to obesity, stroke, and metabolic syndrome. None of which are fun. So we want to make sure that we have those labs in a good standing order, that our HDL can do its job and to keep up with the VLDL and LDL. So that way there's not, more garbage trucks than street sweepers. Sorry, y'all say that 5 times fast. That's a hard tongue twister. Now let's talk for a minute about different types of fats. So there's saturated fats, unsaturated fats, and trans fats. So a saturated fat is a solid at room temperature most of the time. So we want less than 10% of the total calories we eat each day to come from saturated fats. You might see a calculation question on the final about saturated fats. So remember, if I was given the amount of grams of, say, this many grams of carbs, this many grams of protein, this many grams of fiber, and say there's 10 grams of saturated fat that are there too, I would first need to calculate the total calories, and that would be from just the carbohydrates, the fat, and the protein. Ignore the saturated fat first when you are getting the total grams, or sorry, the total calories for that, because that saturated fat is included in the grams of fat. So don't miss that. That's something a lot of people miss on the finals. They think, oh, I've got to calculate this too and add it. But no, if it gives you protein, fat, and carbohydrate, use those three numbers that are provided there to calculate the total number of calories. So remember, I would take my protein, how many grams of protein there are, times 4, and that would equal the calories from protein. I would take how many grams there are from carbohydrate and multiply those times 4 to get so many calories from carbohydrate. And then when it would just say fat, take that number of grams times 9, and that would equal how many calories I have from fat. Then I would add all of those together and for my total calories. Next, I could take those 10 grams of saturated fat, multiply those by 9, and get 90 calories from saturated fat. I then could divide that 90 by that number of the total calories and then multiply it by 100 to find out that percentage. That will tell me whether or not that person met the recommendation of having less than 10% of their total calories from saturated fats. So I hope that made sense as a quick walkthrough of how you would do that calculation. If you need more assistance, please reach out to your instructor, and know too that there have been other live webinars where we have discussed how to do those calculations. So feel free to look at the week that we talked about lipids and fat. if you need some extra assistance and practice on that. All right, so let's get back to just saturated fats in general. So remember, they're a solid at room temperature. I used to remember saturated fats were solids. S were S. Saturated fats were solids. That's how I remembered that there. And no, too, there are some saturated fats that are not solids at room temperature. One of those would be palm oil, and then another would be coconut oil, even though I know coconut oil kind of solidifies a little bit. And those are high in saturated fats, even though they're plant sources. So, no, most saturated fats we think of maybe like lard or butter, since those are solids at room temperature and are from animal products. Most saturated fats are from animal products, but know that palm oil and coconut oil are very high in saturated fat. So, in the last few decades, when it's been very common to use more coconut oil, I've actually seen more heart conditions happen because they're intaking more saturated fat than they would have otherwise had they been using a different oil for their cooking. So you could still use it sparingly, just not as the primary source of coconut oil as the primary source. That's when we get into trouble. And that's part of why having a moderation of foods and a variety of foods can be so helpful. It can be preventative in making sure we're not having a deficiency, but also preventative in protecting, as in this case, our heart health. So, unsaturated fats have two subcategories in them. There's monounsaturated fats. Those are a liquid at room temperature, and that's recommended for most of the fats that we eat should be an unsaturated fat. So that could be a monounsaturated fat or a polyunsaturated fat, which is also a liquid at room temperature. Um, and the recommendation from the AMDR, or acceptable macronutrient distribution range, is that 20 to 35% of all the calories we eat in a day should come from fat. So try to encourage for yourself and the patients you work with that most of their fats they eat are unsaturated fats. That's going to be preventative and help them to have heart health. And also, by intaking those healthy fats, they're not going to have an increase of risk for, say, obesity, stroke, and metabolic syndrome. Examples of healthy unsaturated fats are olive oil, canola oil, avocado oil, safflower oil. So, those are just a few to name that would be a great option to include as unsaturated fats. That's what we have in this podcast episode. Thank you for joining and flame forward.